You'll see, you'll feel the awful, creeping, crawling terror that stands your hair on end.
In the makeup field, he's considered the father of the Universal Monster.
Jack Pierce was born in a small Greek village called Valtetsi in 1889. He spent his youth working as a nomadic goat farmer with his father. Family lore says that Jack had a great imagination. He would make himself up with materials he could find on the hills on his long days herding goats. Jack's family, much like other Greek families of the 1890s, decided to emigrate to the United States of America to seek out the well-advertised American dream. They first came to Chicago, where Jack had no problem learning English and adapting to American culture. And it didn't take long before he found his very first passion.
My first love was baseball. When I was 19 years old, I was a shortstop on Logan Square, semi-pro team in Chicago. I could hit, field, and steal bases back then with reckless abandon.
Jack was settling into Chicago well, although, like many other immigrants, his family decided to head west where it was advertised as a sunny, up-and-coming hotspot with endless opportunities. They ended up moving to a Greek community in Los Angeles, just a few miles from Hollywood. When they arrived, Jack immediately tried out for the California Coast League's baseball team.
It was very exciting. Got off the train, glove in hand, to meet my first professional baseball team. After a full day of working out, I had a meeting with the manager that, still to this day, I will never forget.
Pierce!
Yes, sir?
Now, I know you've come a long way to get here, but this is professional ball, son. I'm sorry, kid. You were good in Chicago. You put on impressive numbers. But why don't you head back there and rejoin the team?
I can't go back, sir, not now. I came here to play ball. Little did I know it then. But that interview with the manager would be a blessing in disguise. If I had made the team, I never would have tried to get into the motion picture industry.
After his disappointment, Jack went on to take any odd jobs around his community that he could get. Being so close to Hollywood's blossoming film industry, Pierce did a few odd jobs on film sets before eventually getting a solid job manning the projection booths for Harry Culver's new movie theater. Harry Culver was a land developer in Hollywood. He had built a few theaters on his land and saw huge potential in the motion picture industry. Eventually, Jack worked his way up to being the manager of Culver's entire movie theater chain.
Harry Culver. What a character. He could talk his way into anything. He founded Culver City, and boy, did it grow fast. A man named Thomas Ince set up a big studio in Culver City, and for many years, all of the big pictures were made in Harry's empire. He seemed to like me. When I wasn't managing theaters, on nights, days off, anytime I could, I moonlighted as an actor. I started to put myself out for any part I could find. Indian, cowboy, even a bad guy. Could you imagine me as a heavy? Not many directors could either.
Although he may not have looked menacing enough to play a villain himself, he realized that he could offer his hair and makeup services to other actors who weren't as capable of doing it themselves. There was a lot of competition in Hollywood, but Pierce used his makeup materials as a secret weapon. Pierce's skills with hair and makeup made him invaluable to any studio that he offered his services to. Eventually, the owner of Universal Pictures, Carl Laemmle, began to take notice of his work.
Carl Laemmle, president of the Universal Pictures Corporation, one of the world's greatest producers.
Mr. Laemmle wanted his company to be the biggest of them all, and he had the land to prove it. He built an outdoor city next to his offices, and we filmed movies out there by the dozen. It was certainly more impressive than the Hollywood studios like Vitagraph, where I had worked before. If he thought his studio could get an edge, have an advantage, it didn't take long for him to tell you about it. But we got along well. I did get to continue acting in the Universal Pictures, but I get just as many assignments as an assistant director or an assistant cameraman. Let me tell you, that is not easy or glamorous work, but I did learn everything about how to make a movie.
In 1926, Pierce landed his first big makeup gig at Fox Pictures. He was asked to create a monkey makeup on Jacques Lerner for a silent film called The Monkey Talks. I'm sure after 10 years of working at Universal, watching Lon Chaney bring his characters to life with makeup, Pierce must have been excited to finally have the opportunity to create his own unique character. The movie had a comedic precursor in the shape of Joe May's Charlie Day Wunderhoff, released in 1916. Although he may have used the look as inspiration, Pierce used his talents with makeup and hair to bring another level of realism to this Monkey Man. Because of his competitive secrecy at the time, there isn't too much information on how exactly he created the makeup. I did, however, find a very brief mention of how Pierce created a monkey makeup in this article. He doesn't mention the Monkey Talks directly, but I believe he may have been speaking of this makeup. Pierce mentions that his monkey face was half mask, half makeup. He mentions using rubber sponge and chamois to build the mask up in 5 separate pieces. He says that the ape's nose was fabricated on the mask to be an inch higher than the actor's own nose, and then the hollows around the inside of the nose were filled with padding. He mentions sewing leather ears into the wig that he undoubtedly made himself for this Monkey Man. Upper and lower artificial dentures completed the effect. No makeup artist was credited in the film when it played in theaters, and the makeup was so convincing, one review commented, "The well-trained chimpanzee had almost human qualities." A journalist who had seen the film reported that Pierce's work proved that there was no such thing as an impossible makeup. He writes, "The question of just how close a director dares bring his cameras up to one of the characters and not show the unrealness of a makeup is passé. Yes, indeed, sir. If you don't believe it, just gaze at this close-up still picture of Jacques Lerner, who played the Monkey Man in Fox's feature production The Monkey Talks, recently completed by R.A. Walsh, and had on its payroll one of screen's best makeup men, Jack Pierce, in charge of makeups." Photoplay magazine reported, "It's a performance that will make Lon Chaney cry his eyes out because it's a real achievement in character makeup." Pierce had finally shown everyone what he was capable of, and when he returned to Universal City, the Universal family had a new respect for him.
The makeup that really brought Jack Pierce to the attention of Carl Laemmle and Universal was his 1926 makeup in The Monkey Talks. Even today, when you look at it, it's a really brilliant makeup. It rivals anything that John Chambers did in Planet of the Apes.
The next year I was back at Universal, doing more assistant work when we heard the most remarkable news. Mr. Laemmle named the person who we never expected as head of production at Universal City Studios, and he did it as a birthday present for his son. Enter Carl Laemmle Jr. Junior Laemmle, as we called him, was given free rein by Senior Laemmle to make pictures right away. I could tell that we were in for an interesting journey. Junior immediately made me head of the makeup department at Universal Studios. He gave me Lon Chaney's old bungalow. Over 15 years in the business, and I now had a new career right before my 40th birthday.
Carl Laemmle Jr. was much less interested in the bread and butter pictures that Universal made.
Laemmle turned to the cinema of his homeland, where ambitious filmmakers were resisting the American trend towards clean aesthetics and glamorous storylines. German expressionist filmmakers were drawn to more troubling themes and darker aesthetics. The novel L'Homme qui rit appeared in America as The Laughing Man, as well as under its more familiar title, The Man Who Laughs. Heir to a British lordship, he is kidnapped by his father's political enemies and surgically disfigured. by a brotherhood of gypsies known as Comprachicos. Chaney was under contract to MGM, where he was being showcased in a rapid succession of films tailored to his persona. Leaving MGM for Universal, even for a single film, was out of the question. Laemmle sought a more unconventional solution. Foremost among expressionist works was Robert Wien's 1919 film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In the role of Caesar was an actor who would become an icon of expressionism, Conrad Veidt. Jack Pierce devised the makeup effects that would spread a grin across Gwynplaine's mutilated face. Veidt was fitted with a set of oversized dentures. Small hooks, mounted on the sides, allowed the corners of Veidt's mouth to be drawn back into that ghastly, permanent grin. The device rendered Veidt unable to speak, so the actor's range of expression was limited to body movement and the dramatic power of his eyes.
Pierce created this amazing, ghoulish, freaky kind of makeup.
It became so iconographic that it became the inspiration for the Joker.
The thing that inspired the original creators of Joker was the silent film The Man Who Laughed, which is really where this started.
Conrad Veidt's performance of The Man Who Laughs was a great success for the studio. American audiences seemed to be increasingly entranced by the German expressionist flair of the films that Carl Laemmle Jr. enjoyed producing. Although they knew that these films did well based on the success of Phantom and Hunchback, they weren't sure if they could pull it off without Chaney. Pierce proved to Laemmle that they could continue adapting more of these classic horror novels without relying on Chaney to be around. As long as they could find a fitting actor, Pierce could use his skill with hair and makeup to match the character in the script exactly. Laemmle set his sights on another one of his favorite novels, Bram Stoker's Dracula. He wanted it to be a talkie, and after seeing the success of Lon Chaney's first talkie, The Unholy Three, he planned to cast him as the Count. When Chaney unexpectedly passed away from lung cancer in 1930, Laemmle had to search for an actor who would be capable of captivating the audience in the same way that Chaney had. Conrad Veidt was considered first, but he didn't like the idea of having a speaking part in English, which he still wasn't very familiar with. He decided to return to Germany after shooting The Man Who Laughs. Enter Bela Lugosi, a Hungarian actor who had been successfully portraying Count Dracula on stage for many years. Pierce, being head of the makeup department, was very excited to have a hand in creating this new vampire, and he had plans of taking it even further than Chaney's makeup in London After Midnight. Much to his dismay, Lugosi knew exactly what he wanted to portray with the Count, and he was very stubborn on insisting on doing his own makeup.
I am Dracula.
Although Pierce didn't touch the Count Dracula makeup, it is believed that he contributed to the look by adding the exaggerated widow's peak.
Dracula is released, and even though it's a huge success, he's not really credited with creating the character.
Although Dracula came first, we actually really think of the Universal cycle as beginning with the Frankenstein monster.
Have you never wanted to do anything that was dangerous?
Karloff's performance is definitely unique and one of the great performances, in my estimation, in film.
My father always referred to the monster as his very best friend.
It's simply the most powerful character makeup ever created for the movies, ever.
I wanted to be Dr. Frankenstein, you know, I wanted to be the guy who made the monsters, and those films were the ones that just inspired me.
The Frankenstein monster was a sympathetic character.
There was this touch of pathos with regard to the monster. You know, he was to be pitied. He didn't ask to be brought forth into the world, and there he was. And because of his appearance, which was not his doing, that no matter where he went or what he did, people were frightened of him.
Frankenstein was originally a project to be directed by Robert Florey and to star Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi was a hot actor. He'd just come off of Dracula, so it was, again, a logical choice.
Although Bela Lugosi was announced as the star of Frankenstein, he had objections to the assignment almost from the beginning.
With the success of Dracula, he didn't want to play the monster, this mute, heavily made-up character. He thought he was too too handsome and too well known, you know.
There actually was a test scene of Lugosi shot for Frankenstein in the makeup. People who have seen it, who were there, all kind of describe Lugosi's makeup as basically resembling the Golem. And the story is that Lugosi had a very clay-like skin, clay-like look, and he also had this big head of hair.
I keep hoping that this footage crops up somewhere. I would love to see it.
Another director was already waiting in the wings, and Flory was soon out of the picture.
There was no paperwork in the files as to why he was taken off the project, but then, as we know, James Whale became the director.
Whale was, I think, more than anything responsible for the choice of Karloff. Whale saw his face and was fascinated by the bone structure of it and called him over to have some coffee or something like that.
He called me over to his table to have a cup of coffee with him after lunch and said he'd like to make a test of the monster and Frankenstein for me. I was delighted at the thought of another job, but I must say my feelings were a little hurt because I had on my best suit and I thought, rather a saucy, straight makeup, and all he could think of was the monster. However, the job was a job.
Films really are a collaborative effort, you know, and so many people are in the mix, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I think this was the case where it all worked so well when you had James Whale, Boris Karloff, Jack Pierce, just all the people involved in this film. It all just clicked.
Jack Pierce surrounded himself with reference books on medicine, criminology, electronics, all these things.
He looked at hundreds of pictures of criminals and determined that there's a criminal look. And Pierce emphasized that look in this movie.
Jack Pierce tells the story about how he came up with the flat head, which never made any sense to me. He says he studied the way that, you know, surgeons work in ancient Egyptian, you know, burial things, and decided that, you know, Frankenstein, not being a trained surgeon, would take the easiest route to get a man's brain out, which is to saw the top of his head off and take the brain out, replace it with the other one, and put it back on. Therefore, he made it flat like a lid of a box. I don't know if he tried to make up an answer after the fact, you know, and where that square head came from, but it works. It makes it instantly recognizable as Frankenstein's monster.
One of the sketches that was done by the art department at Universal showed it as a mechanical robot made out of some kind of a metal. Pierce didn't go in that direction, thankfully.
And of course, he doesn't bear any resemblance to the actual description in Mary Shelley's book, but what he created was something that was perfect for its time.
Karloff had just a great face for it, especially in the original film when he was a starving actor and he was very gaunt and cadaverous looking.
After work at night, he and Karloff would devise the makeup. During that time, which was about a 3-week stretch, they tested different things.
They tried all sorts of little quirky things and then settled upon one thing, and then that was the look for the character.
There were no prosthetic rubber pieces that were stuck on. This was started from scratch every time Karloff sat in the chair.
The frontal bone, the brow here, was fabricated out of cotton and spirit gum and collodion, which is this really strong smelling, very solvent-y smelling plastic. And you would put on a coat of spirit gum and stick some cotton on it and paint some collodion on it and gradually build up the form. Same with the whole top of his head here. The flatness of the head was built up that way. These techniques were quite painful, you know, to have this cotton and collodion built up every day, especially so close to your eyes with a strong solvent smell, and the painful process of removing it as well. It had to be, he had to have amazing endurance to go through this. I'm sure it helped that it was early on in his career, you know. But, from what my understanding as the story goes, that Karloff felt that in some of the original tests he was just he looked too alive, his eyes looked too alive, so he suggested that Jack do something to it, and so they ended up building up these heavy eyelids with mortician's wax over Karloff's own lids, only allowing him to open them part way like this. But he was still able to give an amazing performance with these lids. Another thing that really helped that corpse-like appearance was Karloff had a bridge on his right side, which he removed so he could suck in his cheek. And at one side, and Pierce shaded it to accentuate it. Again, when you think of this makeup, you think of the flat head and you think of the electrodes, which most people think are bolts through his neck. But they were actually supposed to be how the electricity was entered into his body. There's like a positive and a negative, like on a battery.
The parts that made you immortal to moviegoers.
It took us about 4 hours in the morning. Put the Frankenstein face and the head on, Boris. They're newly, and now, wonderful to see.
The best makeup man in the world.
Thank you.
I owe him a lot.
Thank you. Boris, I have little remembrance for the monster that you have portrayed. And I think this will remember the days we worked day and night to create it.
Tell him what it is. Right on the neck.
That's the loop.
That's the bolt.
Electric lot to connect electricity.
I used to call it the Alamite.
I think one of the great things about the Frankenstein monster makeup is it does look like a Walking Dead movie. You've never seen Karloff look more cadaverous than he does in Frankenstein.
There is not a makeup artist alive that wouldn't like to create something as dynamic as the original Frankenstein. Nobody's ever been able to duplicate that, and everybody's tried.
It's quite telling that Boris Karloff, many years later, would always credit Pierce as the man who created the Frankenstein monster. Karloff said, "I was the person who wore the suit, I was the person who filled out the suit, but it was Jack Pierce who actually created the look and the feel of the monster."
It comes together in such a way that it almost feels like it always existed. That's how great it is, like the Mona Lisa.
Jack Pierce, after Frankenstein, was a superstar on the Universal lot. And they immediately put into production a film about the Mummy.